I'm Dr. Sanford Cohen, chairman of the Division of Psychiatry at Boston University and superintendent of the Boston University Commonwealth of Massachusetts Mental Health Treatment, Training, and Research Center. Stress, most simply defined, is the pattern of reactions that prepares an organism for action and enables man to survive. This raises the question, however, of why should it be considered potentially harmful? The answer may be that the ways of adaptation available to man may have become inadequate in view of the complex psychological, social, economic, and political characteristics of modern society. It is this inadequate adaptation to change that may increase the risk of disease. The ability for the organism to prepare for fight or flight was perhaps appropriate when Stone Age man faced a pack of wolves in the forest. But it may be that it is inadequate for modern man in his encounters with demanding employees or quarrelsome marriage partners or a heartlessly joking colleague, or the factor that he's aging in a society which places its emphasis on youth and achievement and rapid and efficient performance. On this tape, we've tried to focus on a few topics that touch on some of our most pressing contemporary problems. In addition, we've made an effort to review areas which suggest how people react to unfavorable environmental and life conditions. The aim of reviewing these topics would be hopefully to develop a model by which life stress can be understood so that corrective health care interventions can be developed. Part of our problem as mental health specialists is to deal with the effects of our rapidly changing world, which is unparalleled by any other time in history. The first discussion is with Dr. Morton Beiser, who is Associate Professor of Social Psychiatry at the Harvard School of Public Health, Department of Behavioral Sciences. In this discussion, we attempt to delineate some of the differences in reactions to stress, which are a function of the culture of the individual. Now, this requires that we look at what kinds of life situations precipitate stress in different cultures, what are some of the typical ways that individuals from different societies cope with the pressures of their society. I asked Dr. Beiser about the different types of political and social values that might be important influences on the kinds of stress that people undergo.
The position in a particular kind of subsystem within a larger system may be stressful in one cultural context and not in another cultural context. Thinking of the kinds of things that have been done studying the birth order, for instance, and the chance of developing disorder based on birth order and sex. And I think there's some pretty convincing evidence that the chance of developing schizophrenia, for instance, is higher among firstborn sons, at least in Taiwanese Chinese, than it is among other racial groups in Taiwan, and certainly compared to rates of the chance of developing schizophrenia among comparable subgroups in our population. The question is, somehow does the fact that the culture is so different create different role expectations and therefore subject different people in the system to stress? Maybe the question of role expectations, or the level of expectations of individuals, is a notion that would cut across cultures, in the sense that people who occupy roles where there are high levels of expectations attached to them are at greater risk of developing psychiatric disturbance or developing some kind of distress, but that the cultural influence is in placing different roles in this line of increased expectations.
A common problem that we're all confronted with now is the role expectation of the disturbances about what one's role should be in at least 50% of the population of this country, and that is women. And what can we say about the role expectations as that's related to different cultures in the world today in relationship to men and women, and whether we see a higher or lower incidence of psychopathology in men and women because of different expectations.
There are at least two dimensions that are important, and one is the level of expectations, and the other one is the clarity of expectations. And probably with regard to women, at least in westernized, technologically developed societies, the problem is confounded by not only increased expectations, but a certain ambiguity about what these expectations are. And this is reflected in most of the epidemiological studies that have been done in the United States, Canada, to a certain extent in some of the Scandinavian countries, where one very consistent finding at a population level is that women exhibit more psychiatric disturbance, primarily in the area of the neurotic disturbances, than men. And the only place that I know of where an epidemiological study has been carried out where that has been reversed, where women actually show less psychiatric disturbance than men, was a study that was carried out in Nigeria about 10 years ago among women, well, among a tribal group, the Yoruba, living in 12 small villages in western Nigeria. It was found that probably the healthiest population of any that's been surveyed in these epidemiological studies is women living in very traditional, socioculturally integrated Yoruba villages. So that somehow there, where the role of women is still clear, where the expectations are fairly high, a woman does have to perform a certain amount. It's not just raising children and caring for children, but Yoruba women are involved in trade and commerce to a certain extent. But at least the roles are clear, even though life is very hard. The roles are clear and the level of disturbance is lower than it is among the men, who are more subject to westernizing influences and more caught between the two cultures.
If you look at the so-called American culture, what are we all about now? Are our goals so ill-defined that we are having problems placing our own activities in the perspective of the total community's activities?
One of the problems with our culture, if you want to call it that, is its fragmentation. That somehow there are goals that are in opposition to each other, that those that are clear are often in opposition to each other. And then there are very vague and ambiguous kinds of goals. And there isn't the kind of communality that one finds in some of these so-called primitive societies. And this makes people uneasy, it makes people uncomfortable. It leads to clashes, intergenerational clashes, obviously. But somehow we haven't been able to demonstrate that the chance of occurrence of stress varies very much by a social class, but that the experience of the stress and the perception of the stress may vary a great deal by social class. This is important because it's a dimension that's very frequently overlooked in the literature about stress in general, and certainly in the literature about sociocultural influences on stress. We have a notion that somehow there are experiences that will be stressful no matter to whom they occur and in what context they occur. Such things as maternal deprivation, for instance. And that the only influence that sociocultural factors bring to bear on that is on the chance of occurrence of these events. But there may be something that's more important and more fundamental, and that is the way in which sociocultural context shapes the experiencing of a particular event.
Then there may be a discrepancy between what a therapist thinks is stressful and what the patient at times thinks is stressful based on their different backgrounds. And if the psychiatrist or a psychologist isn't aware of this, then if a patient isn't talking about some event as being stressful, the psychiatrist may make the assumption there's denial or repression going on, when in reality, based on what you're saying, some events may not be stressful for certain individuals, and others may be. Is that correct?
Yes, that's one reason why I think it's important for mental health professionals to be aware of this kind of consideration. But maybe an even more important reason is that I think there are implications for prevention of psychiatric disorder in these kinds of considerations, particularly primary prevention, and ultimately the development of a public health psychiatry, which I think is the only answer, ultimately, for the kinds of problems that we know exist at a large population level.
Another important aspect of trying to understand the impact of cultural factors on mental health problems is what influence culture has on the reactions to stress, particularly the maladaptive reactions, the psychopathological reactions. For example, are there a difference in the kinds of symptoms that people in various cultures show? And what kind of shapes those differences?
The most current thinking is that psychiatric disturbance is more alike than it is dissimilar across cultures, but that the cultural influence may be at the more pathoplastic level, that it shapes the secondary symptoms. For instance, if you have a notion of schizophrenia as some kind of a basic process, that the cultural influences may shape the secondary symptoms, whether you tend to find more withdrawn behavior versus more aggressive behavior in different cultural settings, and certainly what the content of hallucinations and delusions will be is obviously shaped by culture. And the notion that there are specific disturbances, specific syndromes in different cultural groups has tended to fall out, although one can probably point to some that are culturally specific and maybe raise some questions about what the particular cultural stresses are that shape those disturbances. But I think somehow a more important question, or a more vital question than looking for culturally specific disease patterns or illness patterns, is looking at what a culture defines as disturbance, and somehow the breadth of coverage within cultures, and how this varies, what the tolerance for behavior is, looking at it from a different perspective.
That gets us into the bit on the iatrogenic factor and the influence of culture on therapist behavior and therapist perception, which you've already referred to. And I think we've tended to underplay this as a serious factor, and yet that's something we better consider very seriously, how mental health specialists view what's called mental illness and what we do about it. And more specifically, are there cultural differences in the specific therapeutic modalities that are being utilized?
You see the process going on with regard to some of our subcultural groups, particularly the Indian, and the notion that somehow what the Indian medicine man does is primitive and unscientific and has to be destroyed or eradicated so that we can get what's good into the culture and really treat people in hospitals and with medicines and so on. I think that perhaps there's some recognition that this may not be the most productive way to go about things. There's, I think, a very unique program for training Indian medicine men, providing scholarships for people to study to become Indian medicine men. And it's a long process, particularly on the Navajo reservation. To become a Navajo medicine man requires years of study and requires a long period of indoctrination, requires a long period of apprenticeship with a practicing medicine man. But the notion is that somehow this is worthwhile, that the position that the medicine man has in traditional Navajo society is important to maintain, that the practices, the rituals that the Navajo medicine man practices may be important for restoring people to mental health or for prevention of psychiatric disorder, and that one shouldn't go ahead and try and destroy that and replace it with so-called modern medicine. That perhaps one can supplement this with some of the knowledge from Western psychiatry and incorporate that as part of the medicine man's training, but that's different. This kind of accommodation is different from trying to destroy and replace.
How can we take the information on how individuals react in different cultures to stresses and what defines a stress? How can we take that information and begin to help shape a world which is less stressful to people that live in it?
I think the notion of stress and what constitutes stress and what conditions an experience so that it becomes stressful is important. We have some leads from research and from experience that really ought to be tried out as in the form of preventive programs, for instance. We know something about the need for role models, particularly sex models. We have partial knowledge about the effects of lack of adequate role models, particularly sex models, for young children. What are the implications of that for preventive programs? Would we be better off in terms of a system of national priorities rather than thinking of a lot of programs for eradicating illness or for trying to deal with illness once it's occurred, to think about maybe allocating some of the resources to the school system so that adequate salaries can be provided and perhaps males can be recruited into the school system so that we don't have this kind of problem.
One of the directions that man has to go now is to bring together what he is, man and woman, bring together what they have felt were discrepant roles or discrepant values. And of course, how do we do that, I suppose, is the question for the future.
We frequently hear two contrasting views in relation to children in modern society. One view is that this is a child-oriented society where stress is minimal. And the opposite view is that there is a conspiracy against children, so that stress is marked and alienation is a frequent response resulting from that stress. The focus of the next discussion will be on the psychosocial influences which are currently important in terms of childhood and adolescent stresses in contemporary society. Naturally, we're interested in how we can reduce the stresses imposed on children in our modern world. The discussants are Dr. Gerald Steckler, who is acting chairman of the Department of Child Psychiatry in the Division of Psychiatry at Boston University, and Dr. Leon Eisenberg, who is chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. Dr. Steckler speaks first.
René Dubos, a rather famous developmental biologist, said that the problem with man is not that he is unable to adapt to atrocious environments, but rather that he is able to adapt to atrocious environments. And I don't think anybody has thought of any environment yet that man does not only survive in, but in fact multiplies in. We will tolerate things that probably no other organism would stand for. He would have the good sense to lay down and die. I think one of the questions looked at from the point of view of ego psychology, which is more than just adaptation to existing environment. It's a question, to what extent do we control our environment? To what extent do we determine who makes those decisions? And the system seems to operate that nobody makes those decisions. The changes just occur and then we're caught up in it and have to do something about it. So I think that the educational process or the acculturation process has to have two components in it. One is you do have to give each individual who has dropped into this rapidly changing situation the capabilities, the equipment, the cognitive skills that he requires to deal with the situation as it is. But he also has to get some kind of historic perspective on the world. And as part of the educational process, not only be to live in the world as we know it, but to really start facing the questions from the very beginning of life. What kind of a world do you want? And that this should be as much an issue of schooling as is learning how to read and write, so that we start gaining some control over the rate of change or the directions of society, rather than just assuming we are the passive recipients of this who must deal with it at the best we can.
The problem is we have never yet developed the imagination to do it. In science, there was a discussion of a House of Representatives vote to establish an Office of Technological Assessment. And in the discussion of that, serious questions were raised as to whether the scientists have the capability to predict effectively what the consequences of introducing some new device into the battery of technology would be. However, that doesn't alter the fact that we damn well better learn how to do it. The real chore is to examine what it is one wants in life and to prepare children to look at life in order to be able to guide it in the direction that brings satisfaction rather than being passively manipulated by it.
I suddenly now have a sense of awareness that the statement conspiracy against children has a broader meaning than just a deliberate conspiracy, but there has been sort of a organized effort to sort of develop programs ostensibly for children, which are really to meet other needs. All right, I buy that, and I've been part of that conspiracy, if you will, and I say, now we've got to do something else. Now we must develop programs which will be helpful for children, to help them develop a greater sense of happiness, be able to adapt to a world which they will have some part in shaping. And what do we need to know about children and human development in order to develop these programs? Are we going to be able to improve things by social change only, which, will have to be massive, but are there other things we have to know?
I can't see an effective or meaningful school system that is not a participant in the change of society. The change of society by reform if necessary, or a change that may have revolutionary implications if the forces are so constraining that it takes revolution to change it. Now, this is a very different role from what most people conceive of for the school system, but let me point out to you that that was exactly how the public schools were conceived of by those people who founded this country. Benjamin Rush, who is one of my personal heroes, was the first American psychiatrist and a signer of the Declaration of Independence, spent a good deal of his time propagandizing for a free public school system on the argument that only a public school educational system could prepare a citizenry for the survival of a democratic society.
Here's where I think our background and whatever meager skills we have as behavioral scientists can come into play, because we can look at, say, parental attitudes, and they have been looked at with respect to school, and they're dismal. You can blame the school system for what they're doing, but on a national survey, it turns out that 65% of adults surveyed indicated that the most important value that they attached to the school system was discipline. And you can sort of throw up your hands and say, well, what can we do with something like that? But you can also ask, well, why are the adults holding that position? How deeply held is it? Is it a defensive posture because they don't see any alternates, because they don't know of any other way to live, and so must hold on with desperation to what they feel is the only avenue to survival and maintaining some kind of equilibrium? And I think that what we have to do, agreeing entirely with your idea of parent participation in the educational process, and for the schools to address themselves to the parents as well as the children, is to examine these attitudes, and not only to analyze them in a sense for the parent, but for people to offer an alternate model, that there is another way to live, that you aren't giving up all that much, and in the long run you will in fact benefit from some kind of change in your way of living, whether it is giving up the belief that the most important thing that a school system has to offer is to discipline the children so that they won't rebel against the parent generation.
Let me ask this. I think introduces questions about the future and the direction we go in. I think at the very beginning of our talk together, we indicated that we had to somehow bring to an end the fact that technology was shaping the culture, in a sense, and that it had to be the needs that grew out of the people who lived within a culture that shaped the technology, and that we use resources in the service of the needs of people and the desires of people. Well, we can look to future developments in things such as biochemistry and neuroembryology and a better understanding of structural and morphological characteristics of the nervous system. And it's possible that with devoting resources, we might be able to define sort of certain potentials and capacities that newborns might have. And we all go on the assumption that stress is experienced in some sort of an interaction between what an individual brings into a situation and what he's exposed to. Now, the question which comes up is, with the current inequities with which groups within our culture are confronted, with the terrible moral and ethical problems which need to be altered and modified, should we be devoting our resources to expanding knowledge, to clarify sort of the biological development so that we can better predict how people will respond to stresses and how we can better train them and educate them?
I would say that one needs more information even as one acts on the information currently available, that the support of research is part of what I would see as the activities of a moral society when it's finally created. That is, if one assumed that want no longer existed, surely one of the glories of human life is study, is the search for new knowledge, the confrontation of the problems of the universe, asking of philosophic questions, painting, whatever you like. And these are not superfluous but essential human activities. That they have practical consequences, I think, is a nice incidental benefit, but I think they deserve to be supported just in the interests of the human spirit. So I would certainly not support those who feel that given the urgency of social application, it makes any sense at all to wipe out the scientific enterprise. So I think one is planning for the future, one is trying to grapple with problems that are not so easily answered at the present, as a matter of fact. It is legitimate to ask how the scientific dollar is dispersed, to what extent it is related to problems that are of social urgency to mankind, if one doesn't get carried away too far, since the prediction of relevance is very difficult at the beginning of a scientific undertaking. I would certainly argue very strongly for the maintenance of this, even as we try to apply those things that I've said we know with such certainty. The thing I would stress, though, and that's a very serious problem that I haven't the political sophistication to be able to answer. Up until very recently, the favorite American belief that bigger is better and that progress is endless led many people to the feeling that poverty could be eliminated by simply increasing the gross national product without ever having to take away from them that has in order to give to them that ain't got. It's now perfectly clear that we're going to have to aim for something like a very gradual incline or maybe even a plateau in the growth of productivity. And under those circumstances, with a limited amount of goods and services being produced, then the question is the present distribution to be maintained?
A variety of isms are tearing at the very base of our culture. Sexism, elitism, institutionalism, and racism. These are probably the most significant social stresses with which the American society, if not world society, is confronted. In spite of the seriousness of these problems, mental health specialists have devoted little attention to understanding of the implication of these problems for health care. In this discussion, we will focus on the effects of racism as a stress acting on human development and as a stress influencing the adult behavior of the aggressor and the aggressed against. A most important point in this discussion will be the influence of racist attitudes on patients and doctors, both black and white. I discussed this important topic with Dr. Charles Pinderhughes, professor of psychiatry at Boston University and one of the nation's outstanding experts in this area.
By and large, I see two different systems present in all isms. In every single one of them, there's what I like to refer to as an initiator and an accommodator. And the party, which is the initiating party, presents and cajoles or seduces or employs power or rewards, some other inducement to get the accommodator to accept the belief system, basic attitudes, and the social structure which the initiating party sets forth. And this seems to be true whether the parties be men and women, whites and blacks, teachers and students, management and labor, developed countries and underdeveloped countries, whatever paired parties interacting in this kind of way where there's an initiating party and accommodating party. So that the first thoughts that I have, that each functions as a part of the environment of the other, exerting some kind of effect on each other.
Your description is interesting, particularly since we're trying to focus on some of the mental health aspects of racism and the other isms, although we know perfectly well that we're going to have to get into the social aspects because it's so hard to separate them. But your description was particularly interesting because it came very close to the description of the dyad called, or the dyadic interaction called psychotherapy. One would wonder whether there wasn't a similar model there, and what implications what you've said has to our understanding of psychotherapy now.
In one paper that I have on racism and psychotherapy, I express my belief that the relationship of the therapist to patient usually is basically racist in nature. However, one of the things that hopefully takes place in psychotherapy is the use of enough introjective mechanisms by both the patient and the psychotherapist for each of them to be able to take in and build up a fairly accurate and balanced image of the other. And as they do this, then the image that they have of one another and the persons that they relate to are based upon the building up of more realistic introjects, so to speak, and much less on projection. Those persons who use a psychotherapy method which emphasizes the fact that the therapist basically is projecting all the time just as much as the patient is projecting onto the therapist, and each of them needs to have this kind of corrective experience. Unfortunately, some therapists using authoritative methods can employ basically racist, classist, or some other kind of ism approach in which they seek to get the patient's system, so to speak, to become subjugated to the dominant role of the therapist.
What you've introduced is important for us to clarify as quickly as we can, because I would think that most of our listeners who are involved in some sort of psychotherapy, whether it employs drugs or employs verbal means, are concerned with freeing the potential of men and women who come to them, who function as effectively as possible based on whatever goals and values the person called the patient has. And yet, what you've suggested, of course, which I think we have to accept, is that the therapists themselves have racist and classist and sexist attitudes. And what steps can we take to ensure that the psychotherapist frees himself from these attitudes in relationship to the patients? Or is there any way we can assure ourselves of this, or any approach we can take? Or do we need a new group of therapists trained in a different philosophy and discipline? In other words, are we too far gone?
The principle that I would think needs to be kept in mind is one of having functioning feedback with which the therapist can constantly correct the impressions that he's gaining, more closely conforming to the nature of the patient's experience, the real nature of the patient's experience. The truth of the matter is the therapist can never fully have his impressions conform to the patient's experience, because the therapist is always, by his very nature, having additional associations from within his own body and his own central nervous system activated and attached to the impressions that are coming from the patient. So there's always an additional part in the therapist that's false. But now I would say, too, that the use of forums, presentation of material in psychiatric forums is one way to do it. The standardization of medical rationales and medical methods, all of these are part of what we call the professional development, the professionalism that goes into our work is important as a way of correcting and managing the defects that exist within us and which we will introduce into our practices if we don't have methods for managing it.
Some people have suggested that if we want to bring mental health care, let's say, to black people, and we want to make the situation as meaningful as possible with as minimal stress to the therapist and patient, maybe we ought to have black therapists for black people and white therapists for white people and work for social change in the future, and then maybe we can get the mix. But it hasn't worked very well up till now, the mix, that white therapists have not been able to shake off their backgrounds. I wonder if you're more optimistic about whether we can continue to have a mix.
I'm thoroughly optimistic. I've never seen anyone who was able to live with only the white part of themselves or with only the black part of themselves, which leaves me in the position of assuming that all of what we call white people have both white and black parts, and all of what we call black people have both white and black parts.
Now, what about the problem that we might potentially be confronted with in the black population, where perhaps large groups of people who, of course, object severely to the subservient position they've been placed in, but on the other hand, there may be some psychic benefit to having been as the group that is not as bound by the same morality and conscience as the white group. This gives them a sense of freedom, and the conscience can now be whitey, and one has more license. Although at a conscious level, I would anticipate most black people would reject that. From a psychodynamic point of view, do you think that this is a problem in terms of racism as a stress and what one would want to deal with psychotherapeutically?
That's one way of looking at it. And if we have that exclusive view, we might fail to recognize a kind of group formation that's needed in order to control those things and the supports that each individual needs in the way of a family, in the way of cultural supports. For instance, the lack of organization at low levels in society as compared with upper levels. As fast as leaders are produced, it's fascinating how rapidly they then become co-opted into the white society rather than useful in the further organization of black. And having successfully destroyed the black cultural patterns, as opposed to, for instance, Jewish group, when they were in slavery, they had the family and cultural patterns maintained. Their ghettos became something of a sanctuary, so to speak, as compared with the more disorganized ghetto situations of blacks whose group structure was very greatly interfered with.
As an internationally known clinical psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who has investments in sort of current treatment modalities as well as investments in the future, do you think that our currently popular approaches to the treatment of what we call psychopathology or mental problems is going to help individuals develop the kind of orientation necessary to live in a society where one deals with shared values and community responsibilities? It seems to me that most of our treatment modalities are aimed at a number of things. One is to help the person adapt to society as it is. Two, to help the person be more successful with his achievement orientation in a competitive society, and to express himself more individually and his individual potential more. Will we have to develop new approaches to what we consider psychopathology in order to move towards this community-oriented or communal living, almost?
I think that the only way to do that, unfortunately, is through confrontation processes. Actually, the non-negotiable position of the therapist of yesterday was based on his belief that that was the way it had to be done. And it was only when the therapist encountered non-negotiable positions taken by patients and assumed by our new professionals that they began to take a look at other possibilities. And these confrontation processes which occur, basically, the only kinds of processes that work where there is an irrational belief system, and every group has its irrational belief systems. And I perceive the opportunity for confrontation to occur in the present-day society at a level at which it never was. And this is why the high level of anxiety, high level of conflict, and the high rate of change. I think that the kind of crisis state that shifts in location. The civil rights movement moved from black people to other lower classes, to poor, to women, and one finds it shifting from urban settings in 1 year to colleges in another year and to prisons in another, always in relation to some previously oppressed group, but same processes, and always the same methods, and always the same interactions taking place, with confrontation processes being the principal tool for producing change. Eldridge Cleaver put it in graphic terms and related it also to this discussion we've had about the renunciation of one part of oneself and projection of it on another party, an outside party. As he put it, in the slave relationship, the white man lost his body and the black man lost his mind, gave up his mind. And in the integration process, and in the processes going on today, the white man is recovering his body and the black man is recovering his mind. And this has to do with initiative as well as with other things.
In this discussion, the focus will be on how life stresses acting through the brain, nervous system, and endocrine systems may affect physiologic functions and possibly be the direct precipitants of a variety of physiologic disorders. The importance of ameliorating the influence of life stress in the treatment of a variety of somatic diseases is also of importance. The need to assist patients in developing better adaptive and coping mechanisms for life stress in the treatment of and the overall management of medical problems needs to be reviewed. I discussed this whole topic with Dr. Peter Knapp, who is professor of psychiatry at Boston University, associate chairman of the division, as well as an outstanding expert in psychosomatic diseases. I asked Dr. Knapp how he perceived the relationship of life stress to physical disease.
You begin to see that specific kinds of reaction to specific kinds of conflict can influence disease at various ways. It can contribute to chronic overactivity of autonomic and related systems, finally going on to causing structural damage. It can predispose possibly to the presence or development of disease in an individual under specific kinds of life conflict. It may contribute in other ways that we don't know about to a wide variety of diseases. The stress concept has to become spelled out in much more detail, and I think the psychosomatic contribution to disease has to be spelled out in more detail in a whole variety of ways, in a whole variety of disorders.
There's another kind of feedback that we have to perhaps think about, which is feedback from one's culture. And that may be of some importance, particularly in looking at psychosomatic type illnesses or illnesses that somehow are related to activity in the brain, in that, it's been reported that certain kinds of illnesses are absent in one culture and present in another. In your experience, how important is this cultural factor, the kind of subculture a person comes from and the kinds of physiologic disorders that can develop?
I think it's a fascinating question that's wide open. There's the old story that the African Negro didn't get hypertension in Africa, and then when he comes to the United States, does develop it. Again, that's almost part of the early mythology of psychosomatic medicine, because no really good studies have worked that out. It's a whole transcultural investigation in psychosomatic medicine that is crying out to be done. You have to disentangle the possible genetic contribution from our own experience for many years now with asthma. I'm utterly convinced that asthma occurs in a genetically loaded individual. A baby doesn't come into the world and develop infantile eczema within a week or 2 weeks of birth without having some kind of genetic loading. And the family histories that one gets from people in the cardiovascular area, in the allergic area, and in the schizophrenic area, for that matter, if one studies it very, very carefully, look as though there is some kind of general predisposition that is passed on in some way. I don't think we have the foggiest idea what the nature of that is.
Is there any relationship, perhaps an inverse relationship, between the development of psychopathology as it's expressed in behavior, affective disturbance, or in cognitive problems, and the development of certain psychophysiologic syndromes under conditions, for example, like overcrowding or a condition of loss?
I think one of the early formulations, again, almost belonging to the mythology of psychosomatic medicine, or the mythology of psychopathology in a broader sense, is that nice entities exist and they substitute back and forth for each other. If a person has a psychosomatic disease, it's a masked psychosis, and he may break out of his psychosomatic disease and become psychotic, or if he has psychosis, he won't develop his psychosomatic disease. And then a third great avenue of expression, namely action, also gets drawn into the theory. It's a marvelous dream, that in the future we will be able to get a predictive handle on a whole host of diseases, and finally it comes down to the dream, and some people would call it a nightmare, of genetic manipulation. But I think man is complex. He has difficulty in studying an organism as complex as himself, and it's going to be some time before we really have the right kind of predictive handle, and there are a number of difficulties in the way, because you've got not only to have the prediction inside your head, you've got to instill the predictive conviction inside the head of the subject.
The fact that stress emanates from the current requirements of the environment which are imposed on man does not necessarily mean that man is trapped. it is conceivable that the environment can be changed to meet the needs of man and the capabilities of man. In the next discussion, we focus on the possibility of developing means to more adequately program the environment, which may in the future help individuals living in that environment. This topic is discussed with Dr. George Ruff, who is a professor of psychiatry in the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Ruff is an outstanding educator who has had considerable experience in the development of our current aerospace program. I spoke to him by telephone about the stresses with which we may be confronted as a result of our current technological developments and the goals towards which man seems to be moving.
People are still going to have the same things inside of them and outside of them that have always bothered them in the past. In fact, I suppose in the long run, the things that will be stressful for people 100 years from now will be pretty much like the ones that have been stressful before. But there will be new ones, and that's what we're focusing on now. And I think that the more fluid relationships people have with each other, and then the technological changes, including the very strong possibility that the standard of living is going to drop, maybe precipitously eventually, is going to add to this.
When we think about the change in the level of affluence or the standard of living, is this a function, do you think, of population change or the modification of the resources that we'll have available? Or is there some other factor that you're thinking about?
Well, I think it's both. Again, I think the other factors are a disenchantment, if I can use that phrase, with the results that our technological society have brought us. And it's not so much that a change in the standard of living per se would be destructive, but the optimism that people have had may well change. You know, we've always had this rather odd view of the world as going to improve in every way. It's going to be more peace, less poverty. Everything is going to be better. And now I think people are going to have to cope with the idea that not everything will be better. And I think if the kids get this idea from the beginning, it probably isn't going to be so much of a problem. The problem, as you stated before, is more for us.
That raises the question then of what your concept of the source of stress that people are experiencing now. Where's the major source of this stress, or the major sources? Is this coming from the unfulfilled expectations, or is it coming from sort of internal values and goals and incongruities with what people can find in the outer world, or is it coming from the technological advance, or do you think we shouldn't talk about stresses as being different now than before, that it's really the same contemporary stress as stress of the past?
What are going to be stressful in the future, I think, are largely the internal problems that arise out of our human dilemmas in growing up. We start out as weak children, you know, in a world of adults and develop all kinds of problems during that period, which if we're lucky we adapt to reasonably well in the future. And this is what's going to bother people most. You mentioned the space program. We didn't find in the space program that the things that bothered the astronauts had so much to do with being up in space vehicles and dangers as the ordinary human concerns about who was picked for a flight, what was the implications for people who weren't picked for the flight. And those things will continue. But I think in addition to that, there's going to be more uncertainty. And uncertainty itself is a highly stressful thing for the future. It seems to accelerate year by year.
When you look at a society, as we're now suddenly having some information on, like the Chinese society, and a lot of the information we appreciate is incomplete, where there may have been some changes, at least in contrast to our society. Do you get the feeling that the stress-induced illnesses are less in a society like in China, current People's Republic?
Well, my guess would be that they are, but again, the grass may be greener in that particular sense. I think what we have heard about China has, you know, been fairly carefully filtered. But if I can take just the evidence of what we've been hearing recently, it does sound that way. It sounds like the educational system has aimed people in the direction of the society as it is existing, as it is evolving, and they've been fairly comfortable in that. They seem to have eliminated a lot of social problems. Now, along the way, I think they've cut down on the number of options available to people, and I'm sure for people who like a lot of options, like you and I do, that's probably a disadvantage. But for many people, it may not be a disadvantage.
Suppose one of our colleagues is confronted with helping to develop a preventative program for a group about to be engaged in space travel of a year and a half's duration. Does he have the models at his disposal to help develop a program?
Not really. nobody has considered that seriously, at least seriously enough to do more than token research on it. I don't think now we could really figure out how to have a group interact for a mission to Mars. We probably could get by with it because people are adaptable. But I think after we've had Skylab projects and things of that kind and begun to have some more experience, coupled with laboratory research, we'll be in a better position to do it.
As you've been talking in response to my question, I realized that I may have been using the same defense that perhaps many people in the world are using, and that is to deal with a theoretical problem which isn't really very pressing to avoid one that is pressing. For example, rather than having asked you about a trip to Mars or Jupiter, maybe what I should have asked you is, what kind of things do we need to prepare for if man must go in glass-enclosed cities because he's polluted the air so much that he can no longer exist? That's much more of a real possibility that we're confronted with. And does man have currently, do we have the adaptive capacity to move into the glass-enclosed cities? Or as John Kennedy suggested, maybe we ought to build cities under the ocean. And that was 10 years ago.
I believe we have that capacity, especially because they don't come about tomorrow. You know, first people begin to talk about them and somebody says that's way out. Then people they view as responsible spokesmen begin to talk about them and they think, well, maybe there's something to it, you know. And so step by step you move in that direction. I think people are prepared for major changes like that. And it's not to say that everyone's going to be comfortable with it, but I think it can be done.
Well, I'm glad to hear you're optimistic and encouraging.
My big problem is not can people adapt to it, but is it going to work?
At no time, since the 17th century perhaps, has there been so much doubt as to whether society will continue to evolve constructively or whether it will break under the pressures of its own complexity. We've been assured to some extent by the experts on this tape that stress is a concept which has always been with us, that its definitions will expand as technology and population expand, and that in fact we may be in danger of overutilizing it, making it a catch-all. Perhaps, as mental health specialists, we can help to direct a definition for the benefit of treating patients who suffer from environmental as well as physically or emotionally induced illness, or what has been aptly called existential stress. We must also rely on the social system to guide us through. Most of all, we ourselves must undergo the experience of adaptation and become broader, more faceted, and more tolerant of change. Only then can we invest in an exciting future.
Produced by the Council for Interdisciplinary Communication in Medicine Limited, under a grant from Smith, Kline & French Laboratories.